Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
This is an interview with Professor Sidney Mintz, and I'm Sonia Ryang. I'm doing this for my other mentor, Professor Macfarlane at Cambridge. And it's such an honor to be able to interview one great mentor for my other mentor.
Great honor.
Okay, well, I'm gonna make it very informal. However, I do have some questions that I wanted to ask Sid. But rather than making it so-called structured, and I'm sure we will just wander off and talk about many other things, but I'd like to, maybe the first question I'd like to ask you, Sid, would be, well, you talk a lot about the, I read your piece, interview piece with the Val Carnegie, and I also read the David Scott's piece on analyzing your contribution, and which has been such an enlightening experience. But you do talk about, and it looks like from what I've known about you as well, it looks that the war has had quite some things with your life as well as your entering career of anthropology.
Yeah.
And then also after that, after you became professional anthropologist, war still continued to have some, with various different wars, continued to have some effect on your work and so on. I'm wondering if you could comment on a little bit on current Iraq war and anthropology, reflecting on your past experience.
That's a very interesting question. I guess if I were to talk about the war in which we find ourselves entangled now, the war that we're fighting now. I'm not fighting it. Bush isn't fighting it. Cheney's not fighting it. You're not fighting it. But the war that Americans are fighting now. I would like to begin by going back to the World War II. The oral historian Studs Terkel in Chicago has written a book called The Good War, which is a marvelous collection of reminiscences that he put together on the Americans in World War II. And he calls it the Good War because his conclusion is that of all the countries that fought and suffered in it, and of all the countries that won and lost in it, the only one for whom it was a good war was the United States.
I see.
And I remember as an undergraduate at Brooklyn College in 1941, Sunday, late in the morning, I think, I was lying on the couch in my sister's living room. I slept on my sister's living room couch for 4 years. I was on the couch as usual on Sunday morning, listening to the Schubert Unfinished, which was on the radio. And the announcer interrupted the performance of the Unfinished Symphony to say that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And then they went on and talked about Clark Field and Hickam Field. And it was obvious that we were going to be in war. And I thought about that in terms of my own life. And the next morning I got up to go to school. I was, I think, it was in my senior year, but I was not going to graduate as I should have in the spring of the next year because I was a bad student. I was behind. I flunked one course. Anyway, I was terrible. So I was going to have to go an extra semester. But I was thinking about the war and what it meant. And I got up that next morning, that Monday morning on December 8th. I got up and started for school. And we lived at that time in downtown Manhattan in a housing project. And I had to pass one of the biggest post offices in the U.S., certainly in New York, the Church Street Annex to the U.S. Post Office. And those were recruitment stations. The Army's recruitment stations were in the post offices, among other places. And there must have been, I'm guessing now because I don't know, 75,000 people waiting to enlist.
Wow.
I remember walking by part of that line on my way to the subway, because that war, that outbreak of that war had produced a reaction, an indescribable reaction in the American people. It was as if suddenly everybody in the country had discovered he was an American. It was an astonishing event. Well, of course, I went to school and my friends were all talking about what to do, and a couple of them enlisted right away. Stanley Russell, who ended up in the 8th Air Force in England, the 100th Bomb Group, and Morty Koff, who was my good friend on the wrestling team, and who became a pursuit pilot and flew over 100 sorties on D-Day. A lot of them became real heroes. I didn't become any hero. I stayed in school. I finished in February '43 and went in the Air Forces that same week. Of course, conscription meant that the Army did not consist of skilled soldiers the way a professional Army does. It consisted of ordinary Americans from every walk of life and from every class. And one of the things that struck me most about that military experience was realizing that it is like what we call a rite de passage. Because when you go in, they strip everything off you, including every bit of clothing, your wristwatch. They shave your head. They take all your hair off. It's shaved, but it's left this long. You're like you were coming out of the womb, except that you're a grown man. And then they remake you with their clothing. And when they do that, you no longer are a graduate of Harvard. You no longer are a millionaire. You no longer have all of those things you had before you went in. So it's a remarkably transformative experience. And men who fight after that experience make over their family and their circle of intimacy into the men at whose sides they fight. And it's, for most of us, I never heard a gun fired in anger. I learned this from watching other soldiers, so I don't want to give the impression that I was a warrior. I was not. But from this, one learns that this is one of the moments in life when all of the inherited and achieved skills and prerogatives we have as human beings are totally irrelevant. And what matters is your relationship to the people immediately around you. And then, of course, when the war ends, you put back on the Harvard BA and the wristwatch and the millionaires. All that comes back. And there are many men, and I've known some of them, who've regretted the loss of that feeling of intimacy which they'd had only for that brief period when they were in the service. So, in that sense, it's not all bad. In that sense, war experiences are not all bad. But that was a war that the U.S. had to fight. That was a war, and the U.S. was attacked in a very fundamental way. And looking back on it, it was a war when it ended in which we treated our enemies with, I think, at least understanding, if not tolerance, and where the world could be rebuilt with us being on the side of helpers rather than hinderers. So it was a special time in American life, and I had no idea when I went into the service that I would find war the defining division in my life as a person. There was before and there was after, and it really marked a division in my life that I didn't recognize at first. We are now, and have been for some time, the most powerful nation in the history of the world. And it seems to me that the best use of power is understanding that when you're the most powerful, you have to use power with a lot of imagination. And certainly if one had to describe our society from 9/11 to the present, you would say that one of the essential ingredients in the use of power that's missing is imagination. I think that we have, by hook or by crook, put ourselves into an extremely difficult position internationally and politically and nationally. And for a person my age, nearing the end of life, it's saddening, among other things, not because of the deaths of so many, and deaths and injury of so many brave young people, but also because our country, which had had such a wonderful reputation worldwide, in spite of our power, now still has some of that power, no longer so much, and none of that admiration.
Yes, that's true. Do you think is there any particular way that anthropologists should be engaged in this situation?
Well, you know, we participated, I say we now, and I should explain that. I wasn't an anthropologist then. My undergraduate degree had been in psychology. I ended up teaching navigation. That was what I did in the Air Force. But when I say we now, I mean we anthropologists as of now, me now being one. We anthropologists played a part in that war, which I thought was very important. And though there's much to criticize, there's also much good that came of it. David Price had an interesting meeting at I think the last annual meetings on the war. It had to do with anthropologists in World War II. And I was on the panel, I think simply because I was the only person in the room old enough to have been in World War II. And I gave a paper called Choosing Sides, which had to do with some of the segments of the American population in relation to the war, segments that were not privileged. Very particularly, though I didn't talk at length about it, the 100th and 442nd Combat Teams of Japanese Americans, who won more decorations for valor than any unit in the United States service since the beginning of the country. The most decorated unit in the history of our armed forces, who came out of the camps in order to serve. And I talked some, of course, about American Indians, who were very important in that war, Navajos in particular, who used their language, and other groups, including Black Americans. How the war was a test of Americanism for those people in a way that it was not for ordinary white people like me, ordinary white male people like me. And at the end of the war, and since, one could see how the marvelous inclusivism of American society has opened up little by little to accept into its category of full citizen so many categories that had been excluded, which I think is very inspiring in the history of this country. But for the anthropologists after that war, the picture is very murky and not pleasant. There is, first of all, of course, the participation of anthropologists in Vietnam. This was long before you were in this country, but you probably do know that it split the association very severely. It was very hard on our profession to have to deal with the fact that some anthropologists worked for the U.S. government in an active capacity, though concealed as anthropologists. And since then, of course, the same issues arise. I understand there are some anthropologists now recruiting for the U.S. government, recruiting colleagues for the U.S. government. I think that it really depends on whether you take the slogan, "My country, right or wrong," literally or not. I don't. I think one of the things that makes my country right is my being able to signal when I think it's wrong. And I don't want to surrender, I don't want to forego that prerogative. But I think that now a lot of anthropologists probably are thinking hard about that, and some, of course, have decided, it appears, that they have to support this particular performance. I'm not sure what to say about it. From my point of view, I don't agree with it, I don't accept it, I think it's wrong, and that's all I can really offer. It is also important as part of this picture, though, to keep in mind that it was President Nixon as his parting gift to the American people. He got rid of selective service. He's the person who saw to it that after the Vietnam War, we would no longer draw upon the citizens in a democratic society to fight wars for a democratic society. And this is why we arrive at a point where hardly anyone in the Congress has any relative in the military, and why neither our president nor our vice president has ever served, and why we have an army that is drawn in large measure from the least privileged segments of our population. I believe in the draft. I think that there should be service by all citizens to their country, either in the army or otherwise, and I think it was a terrible tragedy when we gave it up.
Right. Interesting. Yes, of course. Speaking of war, it's Bruce Benedict, who was your teacher.
Yep.
And but also whose work, especially on Japan, became an icon.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it still is
Mm-hmm.
an icon, the best of the best ever book written about Japan. Could you tell us any of your memories of Benedict?
Well, most of what I do remember, or much of what I do remember, I set forth in a paper familiar to you, which was in a book edited by Seidel Silverman, Totems and Teachers. I took my first class with Benedict at a time when I was entering anthropology. In fact, hearing her lecture was one of the main reasons that I decided to try anthropology. She was tall and spare, silver-haired, big-eyed, blue-eyed, quite dried out, quite drawn in. What is the word I'm looking for besides spare and stark? There are other words to describe it. She was a person who seemed fully contained and defended. She leaned toward navy blue as her color. It went with her eyes and with her silver hair. She used lipstick inexpertly. When she lectured, she gazed into space. She hardly ever had eye contact with
Really?
students. She was hard of hearing, but refused to wear a hearing aid. As a result, the exchanges of questions and answers were sometimes quite exotic, because she didn't always understand. But I found her absolutely arresting in her presentations. Following her was not easy. She was a first-rate poet, and she was given to many metaphors. And her lectures had pauses in them while she decided again what she wanted to say and then said it. And you had to take note carefully, but you also had to listen very carefully in order to know what she was driving at. I describe in that paper a particular lecture I heard her give very early on that struck me very forcibly. I was, as I think you know, or certainly many people know, my background is sort of anti-imperialist, sort of pinko kind of background. And in one of her talks, in one of her lectures, she said, well, isn't it a pity that when there were colonies handed out, when there were imperial systems and there were colonies, that they didn't give all of the colonies with submissive people to the Dutch, and all of the colonies with virile, aggressive, belligerent people to the British. Because, she said, the British love belligerent people. They adore the Maasai, and they love the Gurkhas, and they think that the Maori are wonderful. They just love people they can fight because they think they're worthy enemies and worthy subjects. And so we have the Gurkhas, and we have the King's African Rifles. All of these people end up in the British Army doing special things for them. But the Dutch, who are wonderful with servile people, can't deal at all with the belligerents. They don't know what to do, and they have to fight. They don't like it. And so the colonies should have been divided according to
National character?
As you can imagine, I sat there with my jaw hanging down at least a foot. A little Bolshevik like me trying to make sense out of this. But the thing is, that part of it that was uncanny was there was some thread of, not of correctness, but of the possibility of how to think in it that really excited me enormously. It wasn't that I thought she was right about the British and the Dutch, but that you could think that way seemed to me enormously exciting. And I found at other times things about Benedict that were enormously endearing, even though they didn't really change my mind about how to do anthropology. She asked us, the class, to write a paper on, I think, on Jewish religious service, any one, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, whatever one. And I did. And the paper was fun to write because my father was anti-religious and my mother was a radical. Neither one of them did any of that stuff. We'd never had a Seder in our house, and it was just irrelevant. So I could write about my grandparents and then write about my siblings, my sisters. And what's interesting about that is that there was a skipped generation. Because my father was anti-religious and my mother was a radical, they never had this stuff, so it had to skip a generation. So I compared the kinds of social significance of the services my sisters conducted with those that my grandfather conducted. And I finished the paper and turned it in. It wasn't much of a paper, it's a little thing, but I turned it in. I could see what she was asking me to try to do, and I tried to do it. And she called me in. She must have called in a half a dozen of the students. And what she complimented me on, which came as an enormous surprise, was the writing. She didn't talk much about the substance, about the writing. And I said to her, well, you know, when I wrote it, I had some trouble doing it because I wasn't sure what to put down. And I put down what I thought you would like, but I was concerned about the writing. I thought maybe it was too unscientific and too literary. And she said, oh, Sid, I don't object to good writing. I was struck by that remark. You know, here's a miserable little student talking to this great person. Called me by my first name and said that the paper was good. So that I found her enormously encouraging and a kind of a figure, an unreachable figure, but a really very noble one. She never discriminated against the boys in a department where everybody discriminated against the girls. She took positions that were very unpopular politically. She defended people like Gene Weltfish when no one else would defend them. She was a good American. She understood the Constitution. She wrote on race and said things that other people were unwilling to say. She did that pamphlet with Weltfish, was such a wonderful pamphlet, The Races of Mankind, which would have been circulated to the U.S. Armed Forces had it not been stopped by a crooked Kentucky senator who got it stopped. He said he got it stopped because it had a picture of Adam with a navel, with a belly button. But the real reason was that they reported in that on the research that Kleinberg had done on intelligence tests in World War I. And so I found her a really noble person.
Yes.
And I had some difficulties with my fellow Pinkos because most of them didn't like Benedict. They didn't like her anthropology, and they didn't. But they should have noticed more, it seemed to me, what kind of person she was and how inspiring she could be. So I was very high on Benedict. The only two of the group of us that hung out together, the Mondial Upheaval Society, our group of students, the only two who liked Benedict were Eric Wolf and me. The others didn't.
Interesting. And of course, Benedict strikes me as somebody one and only, very unique, politically unlocatable. Yes, she couldn't clear the security clearance because of that pamphlet, that very pamphlet that you talked about. And yet, as like David Scott talks about it, mentions it in his paper, that she did write in her patterns of culture as if Aztecs and other Native Americans existed as if they were still pre-contact. And she did write Japan book that way too. Nevertheless, that book contains the truth that in fact became truth. I would say it wasn't the truth, but it became truth.
You think that on is not really what she says it is?
Well, she gave Japanese culture. She's the one who made Japanese culture. But there's something genius about that book because she knew exactly what Japanese wanted and needed. And I don't know. I mean, of course, because of that book can be problematical, but it's such an enigmatic figure. But thinking about your career, Sid, you always valued field work.
Yeah.
You were one of the first groups of field workers after the war in Puerto Rico, that Puerto Rican project. But obviously, Benedict and perhaps more so Margaret Mead, who lived longer.
Yes.
Mead did, of course, fair amount of field work, but their thing was that studies of culture, what's it called? At a distance.
At a distance. Study of culture.
Yes. In other words, yes, you can do field work, but it's not always necessary.
Yeah.
How would you?
That provokes a comment right away. I think about that. One of the most interesting things about the history of fieldwork in anthropology, fieldwork as a mark or emblem or something that goes along with being an anthropologist, that I find most interesting, is the following. I knew some professors who were very good anthropologists and delightful to learn from, good teachers, who were lousy field workers. Mm-hmm. I can mention two right away. Robert Redfield was a lousy field worker. Benedict was a lousy field worker. But both Benedict and Robert Redfield knew it and let you know that they knew that they were lousy field workers. Now we have lousy field workers who don't let you know, but instead write novels. So is that an improvement? I'm not sure that. Maybe it is.
Right. That is interesting. Did you have any contact, interaction with Margaret Mead at all?
Oh, sure, yeah. We were good friends. When I went on leave at Yale, I taught introductory anthropology there. And when I went on leave one year, she was the person who came to teach my course.
I see.
And that's a source of considerable reflection now, because in her class she had none other than President Bush. And at the end of the semester, because she didn't want to grade any exams or have any exams graded, she pleaded that since these poor young fellows would soon be in the service, their courses, their exams would not be graded, so she gave everybody a B+. And I think that's the highest grade our esteemed president got at Yale. So, yes, so I know Margaret well and spent time in her company, and we argued a great deal. You know, she loved to argue. So. What can I say about Margaret Mead? Margaret Mead, it seemed to me, was unjustly assaulted by, now I'm going to have trouble remembering his name, but you'll help me on it. Guy who non-diac nights.
You mean Derek Friedman?
Friedman, yeah. I think she was done in by him much more than she deserved, and I don't think there was any conspiracy with Boas to do this or that or the other. I think a lot of that was just thin air. But Margaret did like the idea of notoriety. She did like to be famous, and one of my problems with her book about Benedict is it's hard to find Benedict in it. It's almost all about Margaret. I'm sure that I'll be tarred and feathered for saying some of these things, but it seemed to me that she valued too much her public image, and because of that fell into some things that she might better have avoided, to some positions and some points of view that she might better have avoided. I think what was important about Margaret Mead otherwise is that she became a spokesman for anthropology. And even though she sometimes misspoke as our spokesman, we've had no spokesman since.
I see.
And we seem now so often to glory in being able to talk in a way that's totally unintelligible to the American people, and I think that's a big loss.
I see. Yes. I see what you mean.